My name is Martha Broad. I'm the executive director of the MIT Energy Initiative. A little out of breath, but it was a good workout getting here. And I want to welcome you to our October seminar sponsored by IHS. And we collaborate with faculty, and I'm really pleased to introduce the faculty who have helped us bring our speaker here today. And Rania Ghosn is assistant professor of architecture and urbanism here at MIT. And she's, of course, with the School of Architecture and Planning. She has a really interesting organization, practice called Design Earth. And she, along with a partner, have founded it. They're award-winning, and she leads the office's work to engage the geographic, to open up a range of aesthetic political concerns for architecture and urbanism. Her work engages the geographic to open up a range of aesthetic and political concerns and critically frames the urban condition at the intersection of politics, aesthetics, and technological systems, be they energy, trash, or farming. She uses architecture to explore how urban systems change the earth and speculate on ways of living with legacy technologies such as oil fields and landfills. And I will leave it at that. It's a fascinating set of work that she does, and I'm going to have Rania now introduce our speaker. Thank you, Rania.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining tonight's event. It's my distinct pleasure to welcome Emery Sisman for a talk and a subsequent panel conversation on what is petroculture. I'd like to begin by thanking the MIT Energy Initiative for sponsoring this event and for the Department of Architecture for hosting us. I was delighted when this past spring, the MIT Energy Initiative Director of Communications, Emily Dahl, and her team expressed interest in an event that expands the initiative's pivotal role beyond the excellent scientific and engineering research to engage methods and insights from humanities, aesthetics, and design in conversations on energy and energy transitions. In 1833, Joseph Etzler, a young German engineer, published a utopian treatise promising a paradise within the reach of all men without labor by powers of nature and machinery. The inscription of the frontispiece offered an immediate gloss to this social ideal. It reads, "Toil and poverty will be no more among men. Nature affords infinite powers and wealth." Over the last 2 centuries, Etzler's word was made possible, in part at least, by an abundant energy machine of fossil fuels, of coal, gas, and oil that are cheap, accessible, and a rich source of energy. Petroleum and its extraction, refining, transformation, subsequent refining, and consumption has shaped our physical and cultural environment across scales, and yet most of its technological geographies remain for most of us out of sight and external to representation. Scholars have recently begun to address oil's essential role in modern life, and we are lucky tonight to host one of the most important voices in this emerging field of energy humanities. How do we think today about geographies of energy at a point when oil has shed its developmental promises and when projections about fossil fuel depletion and the need to manage climate change formulate the desirability of a future energy transition? The task of making visible the oil landscape seems important, to me at least, on 2 fronts. One is the question on how do we live with legacy technologies such as oil fields and pipelines. In 2012, the French philosopher Bruno Latour wrote that the real lesson of Frankenstein was not that we should or could prevent the creation of technological monsters, but that we should love our monsters, that creators need to care for their creation. The Age of Oil invites us to revise our disciplinary framework, to think, for example, on the intertwined dimensions of history, urban, cultural, aesthetic, literary, and environmental, when narrating the past and future of oil world capitals becomes significant. How do we think of sites such as Baku, Tulsa, Los Angeles, Houston, Dammam, and Stavanger? On a second point, the lessons of the age of oil also present telling stories for contemporary efforts in energy diversification and transitions, to avoid possibly that the Green Revolution purges dirty matters of geography. Much of the promotional culture of sustainable alternatives often perpetuates a series of energy myths, to quote the historian George Basala. Most importantly, that any newly discovered source of energy is assumed to be without faults, infinitely abundant, and to have the potential to effect utopian changes in society. These myths persist until a new source of energy is deployed, to the point that its drawbacks become apparent and the failure to establish a utopian society must be reluctantly admitted. The next new source of energy is not treated any differently. Instead, the recently discarded energy myths are resurrected and bestowed upon the newcomer. The transition to future energy regimes should maybe be accompanied by a reflection on the geographies upon which the current petroculture rests. No little task. I'm very happy to host Himre this evening to start to make this conversation, to move this conversation on how do we make visible and speculate on oil's significance as a prominent material, infrastructural, and imaginary in the early 21st century. Imre is Canada Research Chair in Cultural Studies at the University of Alberta and Professor of Communications and Culture at the University of Waterloo, Canada. He conducts research and teaches in the areas of energy and environmental studies, as well as critical and cultural theory and social and political philosophy. Imre has been curating a series of conversations on how we understand the questions of energy and actively engage the social and cultural changes that are necessary to enable energy transition, namely the transition from oil to other energy systems in our time of uncertainty and climate change. Recent books that he's co-edited include, and of course I forgot the couple of images that come to that, but this is the recent books that he's recently co-edited, which include Fueling Culture, Energy, Humanities, and Petrocultures, all published within the past few months, along with others that maybe do not fit neatly into the theme of tonight's evening, but it's been a good year so far, a few more months to go. So these three books interrogate energy, and in particular petroleum, as a keyword of contemporary culture. They bring together an interdisciplinary approach, drawing on insights from literary and cultural studies, environmental history and eco-criticism, political economy, political ecology, post-colonial and globalization study, and materialisms, old and new. Such collection of works investigates the discourses surrounding oil in contemporary culture, while advancing and configuring new ways to discuss the cultural ecosystem that it has created. They also contemplate the imaginaries and meanings when life is no longer shaped by the consumption of fossil fuels. Rosalind Williams and Caroline Jones have generously made the time to respond to Imre's talk this evening. Rosalind is Bern Dibner Professor of the History of Science and Technology and has served as Program Head of STS from 2002 to 2006. Her main scholarly affiliation is the Society of the History of Technology, SHOT, of which she served as president in 2005, 2006, and from which she received its highest award, the Leonardo da Vinci Medal, in 2013. Her first three books, Dream Worlds, Notes from the Underground, and Retooling, address the question of what are the implications for human life, both individual and collective, when we live in a predominantly self-constructed world. Her new book, The Triumph of the Human Empire, surveys the overarching historical event of our time, the rise and triumph of a human empire, defined by the dominance of human presence on the planet. Caroline Jones is professor at the MIT School of Architecture and Planning. She studies modern and contemporary art with a particular focus on its technological modes of production, distribution, and reception. And on that, she's responding to a talk by the artist Marc Dion tomorrow night around his exhibition here in town at the ICA. She's published on subjects ranging from Clement Greenberg to John Cage to new media to biennial culture in her most recent book, The Global Work of Art. Her edited volumes interrogate the possible agency of representation and experience more precisely in our cultural context. And these include Picturing Science, Producing Art, Sensorium, Embodied Experience, Technology and Contemporary Art, and Experience, Cultural Cognition, and the Common Sense. She's a fellow at the National Humanities Center, and part of her project is to advance an ongoing research tentatively entitled Contested Visibilities and the Anthropogenic Image, a book that she's writing in collaboration with historian of science Peter Gallison, and through which she examines historical cases that show contested moments of picturing human-generated ecological catastrophe. In a modest way, I contribute to this conversation as an educator, an urbanist, and a designer with works on and research on energy. These include ongoing design research on territories of oil in the Middle East, or a graduate research seminar that advances the role for designers in the physical and cultural environment of energy. This is part of a wide array of research here in the Department of Architecture, which, along with Caroline and myself, extends to environmental modeling in building technology, urban studios from the Center of Advanced Urbanism, and material research on automated composite housing and portable energy harvesting solar textile kits, only to name a few. I very much look forward to how tonight's talk and conversation will continue to grow here. And without further ado, please join me in welcoming Imre Sezmen to MIT.
Thanks very much for that introduction. Thank you, everybody, for coming today. So when I had an idea of a different presentation than the one I'm going to give, when I looked at the poster that Rania sent me, this was what it was listed that I was going to talk about, and I was a little bit surprised. But what I had kind of indicated, what I had sent to my respondents, was actually something about the first one, how you can use energy as a critical component of cultural and literary studies. But it seemed to me that it was equally important, and especially for people who are not already doing this work in what's called energy humanities, to kind of give you some background on these other two elements. And so that's what I'm going to be talking about today. And I'll transition at the very, very end into it, talking about energy in relationship to literature and culture. So about 6 years ago, the Petrocultures Research Group was established with the aim of developing a sharper understanding of the ways that we use and abuse energy. Its immediate intention was to examine the social, cultural, and political implications of Canada's turn-of-the-century leap into the ranks of the world's oil superpowers. Our interest in energy arose in part as a result of working at the research university closest to the Athabasca tar sands. In Edmonton, where the University of Alberta is located, it's hard not to see oil everywhere, and not only in the physical infrastructure of refineries, but also in its social costs and consequences: labor dislocation, inflated housing prices, alcohol and drug abuse, and high rates of sexual violence and family dysfunction. Very quickly, however, petroculture scholars also began to grapple with other larger questions. What is energy for in our society? How does the availability of relatively cheap energy affect how we socialize and relate to one another? How does energy shape the form of culture that we inhabit and of cultural development? What are the inequalities that come with fossil fuels, and what is stopping renewables from carrying these same inequalities forward? I have to just mention on this last point, I feel like there's a kind of a very strange connection that we've made, and we imagine that if we have solar power or other kinds of renewables, suddenly there'll be all other kinds of social inequalities will be addressed as well. I'm not sure how this kind of connection got made, but I feel like it's there in our social imaginary. We moderns still tend to take energy as a largely neutral aspect of social life, as little more than a dead input into the motors of a society whose form and rationale originates at a distance from coal mines and oil fields. But the forms of energy we use and how we use them shape society through and through, and not just in how we work, say in factories instead of fields, or in how we move around, using horsepower instead of horses. This is what we mean by petrocultures, the term that gives our group its name. Petrocultures is the global culture we find ourselves in today. It is the name for a society that's been organized around the energies and products of fossil fuels, the capacities it engenders and enables, and the situations and contexts it creates. It's not just that our physical infrastructures depend on oil and gas, or that our social and economic practices have been organized around easy and cheap access to fossil fuels. The relationship to our dominant energy form is deeper, pervasive, and constitutive. To say that we inhabit a petroculture is to say that we are fossil fuel creatures all the way down, all the way through. Our expectations, our sensibilities, our habits, our ways of being in and moving across the world, how we imagine ourselves in relation to nature, as well as in relation to one another, these have all been sculpted by and in relation to the massively expanded energies of the fossil fuel era. To give just one example, in the potential shift from gas to electric-powered cars now promised us, what is rarely questioned, all too rarely questioned, is the necessity of the automobile itself. As inhabitants of a global petroculture, we have all come to expect the mobility, freedom, and autonomy of mechanized movement by land, air, and sea. Those parts of the world that don't yet have a car in every garage see it as an index of economic and social progress, a sign of having joined the modern community because, at long last, they are able to use energy at the same level as those in the global north. Over the course of this century, we will need to undergo an energy transition, a shift from an economy and society based on energy derived from fossil fuels to an economy and society based on a mix of energy forms. This transition, if we in fact undertake it, will constitute the greatest experiment, the greatest social experiment in human history, a planned, plotted, and predetermined shift from one kind of society to another, from the petrocultures we inhabit today to some other form of society. Real energy transition has to involve social, political, and cultural transition too, with attention to how energy has shaped us and the importance of energy to human collectivities. We should not imagine that we carry out our environmental duty when it comes to energy by asserting that we all stay away from the dirty stuff and hope scientists come up with lots of clean stuff. At Petrocultures, we see this energy transition as an opportunity for a transition to the kind of society many of us have long imagined, collective, equitable, and just in all of its practices and principles. Just how might we trigger a transition like the one I'm describing? My comments today draw in part on an experiment in collective thinking and writing that Petrocultures carried out and which I led, called After Oil School. 35 scholars, politicians, and artists spent 4 days together mapping out how we might engage in transition, which resulted in this small book here called After Oil, which there's free copies of up here if you're interested, and you can grab at the end of the talk. And I guess what I'm going to be talking about connects energy transition with cultural transition. And then at the very end, I'm going to turn to a discussion of cultural analysis in relation to energy. So, 4 parts. Just what is oil? Oil composes space and shapes culture. It modulates our lives, including the clothing we wear, the objects we use, the buildings we occupy, the spaces we move through, the daily routines that structure everyday existence, our habits and perceptions, our commitments and beliefs. Oil, as a metonym of the larger fossil economy, names a way of organizing society, of bringing people together and of keeping them apart. Oil modulates everything not because of some natural or magical property of the energy source itself. Rather, oil expresses a social system bound up historically with the rise of modern industry and industrial capital, including the creation of an industrial working class, the birth of middle-class opportunity and material privilege in the West, and the mirrored acceleration of precarity and mass unemployment across the globe. Energizing the labor process at the site of production increased the productive capacity of workers, but it also gave business owners a solution to the rising cost of labor. Today, we call these phenomena automation, offshoring, and capital deepening, Yet as economic strategies, all three depend on more and more non-human energy in the form of transportation and more efficient machinery. To describe oil in this way is to view the problem of energy transition from an unfamiliar perspective, as the object of a social challenge. For to transition from oil to some other energy source will entail, whether we like it or not, whether we participate in the process or not, it will entail the unmaking and remaking of our social worlds. Undeniably, this prospect is daunting, even overwhelming. But might its challenges also offer surprising promise and possibility? What is intentional transition? If oil so saturates our cultural and social imaginary, then what is one to do? What options are available to us in the midst of this tectonic transition that is moving underneath our feet and circulating in the air we breathe? Given that we are already deep in the midst of transition, if perhaps not an intentional one, not an intentional and focused one, where should we locate ourselves? The default position is a disabling one. It is to assume that this transition is a purely technological problem that will be resolved through technocratic solutions. Such a position assumes that responsibility can be entrusted and handed off to someone else. Reinforcing this default resignation is the embedded assumption that the market will resolve the crisis. This too presumes that the only intentionality needed is that of market forces, and that we as individuals and communities need not participate in shaping, hoping, or imagining, except along narrowly defined consumerist lines. To accept this default position is to abdicate agency. It's to abandon to someone else the creative act of making the world and the values that it will hold. An intentional transition reframes the energy question as a humanistic one, requiring our vote in the matter, our intentionality, agency, and the assertion of values and desires that we hold. As such, it begins by taking account of where we sit historically, where we find ourselves in terms of our infrastructural dependencies and our affective and indeed even our erotic attachments to the fossil economy. An intentional transition begins by reckoning candidly with the problem of the path dependencies that are required for survival in a post-oil economy, and with an acknowledgement of the attachment to desires realized under the fossil economy. But it then moves beyond oil to a reckoning with the failures, the blocked desires, the pain and the penury, the inequality and injustice, which the fossil economy could not resolve under its terms of management. Principles of intentional transition. People always ask me, like, what do we do about it? So I'm finally going to tell you. An intentional transition, as I said, is premised on agency, on the conscious participation and mobilization of people and communities. In this respect, conscious participation cannot be reduced to the meager practice of constituencies being brought into a discussion after the terms of the debate have already been set. It means people being brought together to establish the framework for the debate from the start, so that its terms and its conduct conforms to their hopes, their needs, and their values as individuals and communities. That should be the very first one of that. That's agency mobilization, sorry. Second, collective stewardship. An intentional transition is premised on collective stewardship, on the avowed right of people and their communities to own, manage, and develop the energy resources that conform to their desires and needs, and their support for ideals for reproducing and producing the health of their communities and the values they hold. In this sense, public control is distinct from the prevailing tendency toward private control and increasing private management of this epochal transition. Why can't energy be something akin to water? Something, a good that is managed by all of us. Third, equality. An intentional transition has to be premised on equality, on the rights of all peoples and communities to adequate energy resources for survival. It's to acknowledge that life under the fossil economy did not fulfill for many people or communities this basic human right, and that the fossil economy produced wild inequalities that left much of the world behind while conferring the privileges of energy along unfair and wholly undesirable racial, national, gender, and class lines. In the old world, prior to transition, you were rich because you happened to inhabit a part of the world that had oil under it. That can't be possible going forward. Fourth, ethics of use. An intentional transition is premised on a clearer understanding of the ethical dimensions of energy use and the hierarchy of human priorities. Intentional transition means collectively sorting out the moral differences between the use of energy for more elementary needs we all have for food, water, and the basic essentials of life, and the surplus material and immaterial desires that energy quite literally feeds and fuels. Fifth, sustainability. An intentional transition has to be premised on sustainability. It distinguishes quite clearly between accepting the risk of an increasingly obsolescent fossil economy and embracing the opportunities of an after-oil economy in which energy is thoroughly socialized and generated within a framework of sustainability. Sixth, a redefinition of growth. An intentional transition is premised on growth and development, but it does not take these terms as self-evident. Instead, it redefines these much abused terms as something distinct from business as usual. In the after-oil economy, growth and development are tied to the social values articulated above and joined to a new ethics of resilience and sustainability. Growth and development are taken out of the hands of the economists and given back to the people. Apologies to any economists who happen to be here. Final section, transitioning desire. Some of the challenges involved in intentional transition can be grasped by considering just one of its many dimensions. Shifts in how desire is coordinated by and in relation to the use of fossil fuels. We live, especially in the Western world, in an era of unmatched material plenty, in which desires are indulged and encouraged no matter how trivial. A consumerist ethos pervades our culture, and for many it appears that we inhabit, in the words of former American President Herbert Hoover, the world of the constantly moving happiness machine. This incredible cornucopia of the 20th and early 21st centuries, this thing called the Great Acceleration, what others called the Great Derangement since 1945, would have been unthinkable without a cheap, portable, seemingly infinite source of energy in the form of petrocarbons or oil. As we've seen, our dependence on oil has had unforeseen but profoundly dire consequences on the ecological health of our planet. Attempts to address this crisis have largely concentrated on advocating transition to more renewable forms of energy. Yet, as critics such as the great geographer, historian, scientist, writer about energy, Vaclav Smil points out, as he points out in many works, for him at least it seems unlikely that forms of renewable energy will in the near future be able to supplement our current energy demands, let alone supplant them. Our present circumstances amount in part to a crisis of desire whose resolution may depend less on finding new forms of energy than on restraining, curbing, or reshaping what looks to be a limitless desire provoked and fueled by consumerism. Such a formulation sits uneasily with the modern temperament, and in the face of promises of unrestrained plenty, the suggestion of restraint smacks of puritanical sanctimony. Who are you to tell me to forgo my desires, you might ask. Nevertheless, tackling the question of desire need not require the suppression or even renunciation of desire, but, as many critics have argued, its redirection. If life in consumer society promises a dream of endless ease and joyful satiation and satisfaction, its critics for a century now, have pointed precisely to the profound gap between this dream and actual lived experience, noting that the actual pleasures and happiness experienced fall short of those promised. To such critics, the consumer citizen appears very much akin to a dog chasing its own tail, pursuing an elusive goal that it can never achieve, no matter how fast it runs. Given the frequently noted intimate connection between petroleum as primary energy source and the deterritorialization, intensification, and acceleration of production, it is to be wondered whether the transition from fossil fuels might itself offer new opportunities to satiate human desires for things as a more intimate connection to local, social, and natural communities, fulfilling work and free time. I lied, there's one other section. And this is back to that beginning part about culture in relation, energy in relation to examining culture. And I guess I could speak to I gave a paper to my colleagues who are going to comment on it, but I think this short page will speak to that as well. Like no other text that I've encountered to date, a book by the novelist and critic Amitav Ghosh called The Great Derangement links the modern novel to the era of oil. In part, this book by Ghosh constitutes an extended and expanded analysis of what he has called the novel's failure to take on the oil encounter. What Ghosh has said, Ghosh is originally from India, he's puzzled why in an era in which oil has been so important over the 20th century, there are very few novels at all that speak about oil, that address it directly. He's surprised that the American novel in particular seems to have no interest whatsoever in the substance that gave the United States its power, much of its power in the 20th century. He's surprised that it only appears as subject matter in some novels, in very few novels, and generally in post-colonial novels. And we can argue with Ghosh about this, but I would say that one of the surprises that I have had as somebody who's been more and more interested in energy is the degree to which I don't find it represented in the objects that I'm most interested in. Then one can run around and find like examples where counterexamples, but they're really just minor examples given how essential this commodity has been to our lives, to shaping who and what we are. It's interesting how this very, very dominant, important, culturally important form seems to have no interest in it whatsoever. But Ghosh poses another question now. He asks, why hasn't the novel made climate change central to its depictions of contemporary reality? Ghosh remarks, few indeed were the quarters that remained unperturbed over the last few years by climate change, but literary fiction and the arts appear to have been among them. Shortlists for prizes, reviews, and so on betray no signs of a heightened engagement with climate change. And indeed, that's true of the last year of literary lists for literary prizes. We seem to be interested in the in narrative self-development, in the unfolding of the liberal subject, in the encounters that a subject has societally. That seems to be our fascination with the subject, with the individual's experience. That's what the novel has become about. And what Ghosh says about that is that, in a way, it has to do with the fact that literary fiction, and this is a quote from him, it derives from the grid of literary forms and conventions that came to shape the narrative imagination in precisely the period when accumulation of carbon in the atmosphere was rewriting the destiny of the Earth. The forms and conventions that he points to are ones in which the novel mirrors developments across the humanities and social sciences. The production of the modern worldview in which nature was moderate and orderly, when regularity and predictability came to inform the practices of science as much as the operations of governmentality, and when the individual is championed over the collective in liberal philosophy as much as in the novel's individualizing imaginary. These are more specific claims than the production of the expansionary drive of the cultural, the kind of energy unconscious that I've been narrating here. But they articulate some of the same intuitions about the link between culture and society and energy, and name some of the limits and problems of the literary and other representational forms when it comes to global warming. Ghosn asks, is it possible that the arts and literature of this time will one day be remembered not for their daring, not for their championing of freedom, but rather because of their complicity in the great derangement? End quote. Is it that they're going to be remembered for their collective imaginative failure in the face of global warming? We need to consider a transition not just in energy forms, but in our social forms and practices too, as I've been saying throughout this presentation. Might this include one of my objects of interest, my objects of scholarly interest, the novel, and other cultural forms that grew to life when energy was cheap and abundant? Thanks very much.
So possibly to respond to the provocation of literary and cultural works responding to energy and energy transitions, Rosalind, do you want to follow up on the literary attributes of the works? Thank you.
I want to take on Ghosn.
Yeah?
Yeah. I think he's wrong. But actually not about, not talking about today's literature. I'm here, I double majored in history and literature. So I'm here to tell you about, there'll be 2 examples from history and 3 from literature, works that absolutely address these issues. And the problem with energy is that it's everywhere, and so it's hard to see. It's not a thing, it's a relationship, it's a force, and we often see the thing, but it's like seeing the petroleum, but not the energy. It doesn't have to be petroleum in your car. Anything that could drive it would work. But we see the petroleum, and that becomes what we focus on. Hold on. So, first of all, I just want to say there is a subdiscipline called the history of technology. And it has a lot to say about the history of energy. But it's often intertwined with the history of material things. So matter and energy, as we all know, are transferable, and they go together, and they often go together in history. But what's interesting about the history of technology is that people who practice this also try to work in social organization. So it's the intertwining history of energy, matter, and social organization. One book I want to describe as an example of this has just come out, or quite recently, and this is James C. Scott's book, Against the Grain. That's titled after a novel, a French novel, if you don't already know that, subtitled A Deep History of the Earliest States. And his history of energy begins with fire. And he talks a lot about the invention of fire as being so important in increasing human energy ability because it allows you to digest food much more quickly. The colon can be a lot shorter and the brain can be a lot bigger. So he describes this as kind of the beginning of human history in and of itself, is the technology of fire. And he also talks about the transformation of the landscape and claims that the age of the Anthropocene really began back. As soon as you had fire, you were transforming, you being humans, you were transforming the face of the earth. But he also has a very interesting description of the use of grains as opposed to other sources of food for humans. Other sources being legumes or root crops, but he talks about the favoritism for grains because they are more readily measured and weighed and can be seen when they're harvested, and they're harvested all at once, and you can't hide them, and therefore they're very good for states or state-based actors that want to tax. They're much more amenable to the taxation, that is the grains of wheat, barley, rice, maize, than other forms of food. So he's claiming that the extraction of energy from grains was favored because of social organization, and it was not necessarily just a sun-given preference. That started me thinking about whether fossil fuels could be thought of in a similar way. In other words, to make money off of fossil fuels is a lot easier, I think, this is my hypothesis, than looking at wind or water. Anyway, I just throw that out as something to think about. And the work of a historian that really gets us thinking in a new way about the history of energy. However, this is not new, and I also want to tell you, or remind you maybe, about the work of Lewis Mumford called Technics and Civilization, published in 1934, where he is taking, well, let's see, Scott would call it a package. Mumford calls it a technological complex. He's describing periods of energy use that are coordinated with periods of material use and social organization. And he terms them the eotechnic, the paleotechnic, and the neotechnic. And in this fascinating book, he describes each of these technological complexes in historical order and weaves in their discussion of energy, matter, and social organization. So just for example, the eotechnic is about the year 1000 to the year 1750 in the West, and he's very generous in describing the innovations that were made, particularly in harnessing the service of wind and water. And he says, as a result of these, efforts in that period, a large intelligentsia could come into existence. Also, great works of art and scholarship and science and engineering could be created without recourse to slavery. It was a release of energy, a victory for the human spirit. And this is what I like about Mumford. He's dated in many ways, but he's always talking about human desires as well as matter and energy. He also talks about the material of wood and glass as being characteristic of the eotechnic. The paleotechnic, that's the bad period. That's fossil fuels, that's coal and iron. And then the neotechnic, he's very positive about this, or hopeful. He's writing, remember, right, just when electrification is taking place worldwide. And he says, no longer, is energy dependent on the coal mine, because electricity can be produced in very different ways. You've got much more variety. It's much more portable. It's very optimistic, probably too much so, but it's fascinating to go back and look at his predictions for the neotechnic phase in light of where we are now. And it's holistic and it's exciting, and that's an example of what a great historian can do. Now, what can great writers do? What does literature add to this? Literature reveals the energy that is often hidden because it's mixed up with so many other human activities and materials. In other words, literature can go back to the incarnation, taking the abstraction of energy and showing how it is embodied and made tangible in human life. Literature also sees energy whole. It sees energy from human experience from the inside out, where many dimensions of energy use are integrated in one life. So I'm going to give you 3 examples from literature, US literature. And I owe this whole part of the talk to Leo Marx. Okay, 1, Moby Dick is the oil-based novel. And if Ghosn doesn't know that, he better reread Moby Dick. This is where the age of sail and wind is turning into the age of oil before your eyes, because you're chasing whales and you're chasing them for their oil. And if you really want to get carried away with the power of what Melville does, in this book published in, actually, October 18th, I looked it up, October 18th, 1851, go to the Tryworks scene, chapter 96. The Tryworks are where on the ship that's on the water, between the wind and the water, you have a fire, and you are essentially distilling the whale blubber and extracting the oil from it, and you are feeding the fire with the kind of leftovers of the blubber. So you start the fire originally with wood, but from then on it goes with the whale's own body feeding the fire. The whale supplies its own fuel and burns its own body. And this passage ends, then the rushing Pequod, that's the boat, the ship, thus the rushing Pequod, freighted with savages, laden with fire, and burning a corpse, and plunging into the darkness, the blackness of darkness, seemed the material counterpart of her monomaniac commander's soul. And if that doesn't capture tonight's news, I don't know what does. Just reread Moby Dick, and you've done the most important thing. Second, though, here's a book you haven't heard of, but it was written in the 1890s. It's about Maine. It's called The Country of the Pointed Firs. It's very quiet, and the reason I bring it up is because it focuses on where energy systems have retreated. I mean, Maine used to be a big shipping area. It was no longer that way by the 1890s. This is a novel about a place where energy has retreated and used to be there and is no longer. And I think we always kind of look at where energy systems are going. I think it's also worth looking at where they're sucking away activity and where they're, in Leo Marx's words, he said, the Industrial Revolution is taking place off stage. In other words, you're in Maine and you're seeing the results of it by the retreat of energy from an area. And this also is very relevant. Second section of the Times today, front page story about small cities in the US and how they're at such a disadvantage compared to large cities. Same story. Third one, again, this is The Education of Henry Adams. Now, if you haven't done it lately, go back and read chapter 25, The Dynamo and the Virgin, where Adams is being shown around the Paris Exposition of 1900 by his friend Samuel Pierpont Langley, as in Langley Field. They're looking at things, and Langley just goes to the energy. He wants to go to where the force is. And it begins a sequence of chapters on force as the clue to human history, the sequence of force being what Adams recognizes that he is seeing around 1900. And it's not just the dynamo. It's also all these scientific forces like X-rays that he can't understand. They're anarchistic, they're chaotic. And he asks, what does this mean for civilization? So, oh boy, I wish I could read the whole thing. But let me just say, he's bowing down to the dynamo, worshiping it as if it were the Virgin. And he's saying, the Virgin used to be the locus of desire because sex is power, sex is force. But now we don't worship the Virgin, we worship the dynamo. What does this mean for a civilization when you're worshiping man-made force as opposed to supposedly a God-given force? Anyway, he says, he finds himself lying in the gallery of machines at the Great Exposition of 1900, his historical neck broken by the sudden eruption of forces totally new. Okay, this is just a little sampling. History and literature have a lot to say. And okay, that's all I really need to say myself. I'll let them speak for me. Thank you.
All right, I'm going to try and speed through this so we can get to our own conversation. I tried to do a little bit of applied Zeman so that we could think about the force of his argument and what he's recommending in Energy Humanities. I should wave that book around, but I can do it later, is that we radically rethink as historians and culture writers of periodization. For myself, I want to introduce into the conversation the Foucauldian and Deleuzian concept of visibility and invisibility. so that when we look at a cultural object, we can ask, what is it making visible, and what, by extension, is it writing out or not making visible through the very same regimes? And then finally, I was very struck in the paper that he sent, which he didn't give, by this concept of, unlike coal, petroleum's capacity to be dissociated and to dissociate us as subjects from the source of our energy. You know, coal was this rock, you shoveled it in to something that you were making energy out of, whereas with electricity, you have, the dissociation from the source, which I thought was an extremely interesting heuristic. So taking his idea of periodizing history differently, we have both the materials that could periodize these epochs, but we also have the kind of energy produced. And once you get electricity, of course, everything is fungible, right? The source that powers the dynamo could be steam, could be wood even, could be coal, could eventually be oil, could be nuclear power, and so on and so forth. But taking these periodizations, I thought it was interesting to just plunge you into one of the great chestnuts of modern art history, which is Turner's Rain, Steam, and Speed. And this is dissociation in action, in a certain sense. So Pache Ross-Williams' conversation that we just had, the benefit of her insights to literature, it may be about energy, but it is also making invisible the source in terms of the mines where the coal is being extracted, in terms of what's happening in Wales, right? This is outside London. We're seeing speed itself, right? We're having the ideology of speed and kind of fluidity of motion created for us. There's a lot more to be said, but I just want to throw this out to help us think about these capacities of the human, to not visualize while they're visualizing, right? This complicated heuristic. Interestingly, we can see in some of the paintings of modernism the unevenness of energy distribution, even within the supposed, hegemony of Europe itself, right? We can see that in Italy, the futurists are still depicting horses. They're still struggling with the idea of animal power, building their cities. Whereas in Paris, by that point, just 8 years later, you have a sense of energy completely free-floating, completely, denying its sources and sort of ideologically producing itself as a machine turning quickly, right, without source, without material. What Simon argues in some of his work is that petroleum, but I'm going to generalize this, that the human discovery of different sources of energies are world-making devices, right? That they produce worlds through their capacities of shrinking space and time and creating these ideologies of fluid movement. In my own domain, this is just what I talked about. What I find interesting about the art of the 1960s is that you do begin to get a visualization or a visibility for the extraction, for the stuff itself, for the material, and for the complex social costs and institutions and infrastructures that are built around energy extraction. And here's just, two well-known examples. Robert Smithson, the great theorist of entropy, engaging in a way, returning the asphalt to the earth in this gesture that he does in Italy. Hans Haacke, a much more organized in his institutional critique, creating an entire narrative around oil industries, extraction industries, funding culture precisely to make their pollution invisible, right? There's a book called Oil Washing, which is really about these cultural operations. So it's interesting that this enters the art world specifically. But in Walter de Maria's lightning field, you have a focus on energy in a kind of pure form. So what is being made invisible, even as the energy of electrical forces around the earth are being made visible? Well, if you actually go here, it's a virtual ritual of beautiful invisibilization in a way, right? You don't see the wires that are hidden in this rustic cabin. You don't see, in other words, it's all about creating a kind of technological sublime, and what James Nisbet calls this sort of energic, this energic domain. But the art really functions by mystifying how the poles got there, or how they're attached, or how they, where the titanium comes from to sharpen the points, and so on and so forth. And this is not, I would say, a critique of, all of art. I think we just have to understand that art is engaged in a variety of operations where energy is clearly an obsession of artists, but it doesn't always get us to this transition that we need to make. Alternative forms in Zeman's work are just trivial in terms of our addiction to oil, so that's just something I want to surface for our discussion. I think in the end here, I just want to leave you with two broad heuristics of the many we've talked about. A kind of critical Anthropocene narrative, what have we done, or what we have done, and here I'm just showing you Richard Mizrach's great, one of the many photographs from his cancer series, where he also talks about petrochemical America, and contrast that with this idea of the utopian Cthulhucene, as Donna Haraway has called it. We have to practice on pronouncing that, what we might yet manage. And here I'm showing you a piece from an artist that I've recently written about, Annika Yee, in terms of biofiction. And I'm finding this realm of what I'm calling biofiction, this kind of art that, partners with bacteria in this case, or might involve insect life, or, might create a Brancusi sculpture for a hermit crab to take up in the case of Pierre Huyghe. I'm interested in these forms because I think they might propel us toward this kind of radical reimagining of our place. We are symbionts, and almost nothing in our culture helps us acknowledge that and acknowledge how dependent we are on a million other life forms, some of which are in our body, right? We have more cells of bacteria than we have cells that are human in our body. So, in a way, I leave us with this kind of new edge of the, let's try it again, Cluthocene, because it kind of returns us to E.O. Wilson's question of how will humans be? How will we evolve? Will we evolve greater partnerships among ourselves and among other species that we are symbiotically dependent on, or will we, stay with our primate, our small group primate, natures so far? So these are questions that we can maybe discuss. Oh, you want to look at baboons?
I want the piece you wrote about. I love that.
Oh, the Annika. Okay, so where are we? We're down here. Yeah.
Yeah.
Sure. So how do you want us to sit?
What about we all move to the big table? And I think there will be a mic moving around for questions from the audience. I think we can go a bit over time, maybe overrun by a few minutes. So I think we'd like to take a few.
Yeah, I think, maybe I can just start you off. I think what I was most interested in was your last point about desire. This is very high on my list of things to think about, because I was in London for the Serpentine Marathon, and there was a wonderful artist who's thought really hard about all this stuff. But his main criticism of AI and of the autonomous vehicle was that it was going to take away his autonomy. It wasn't. I think you can all hear. Anyway, it was fascinating that, as critical as he was being, and he's created all sorts of pathways that will stop the car from moving anywhere and so on. I mean, his critique was based on the old ideology that he should be able to drive wherever he wants, and he should be in charge, and he should be, a Marlboro man, on the edge of some Western universe. So I think that changing ourselves is a really complicated and long job. And I don't know, so that was.
Yeah, I thank both of you for your comments. I'll just say in response to what you just said, Carolyn, it's that if there's two takeaways, I guess, from the work that my colleagues and I have been doing, one is simply to say we have not really given as much thought as we should to the degree to which energy systems shape who we are. There have been people who have, of course, given thought to energy systems. It kind of comes up every once in a while. There's not just the Mumford, there's Lewis White after World War II in the field of anthropology. He gave a lot of thought to energy systems and the way that they shape human communities. But it seems to fade out of existence. I guess what makes this current moment quite distinct is that we are faced with the necessity to think about how we might be in relationship to different kinds of energy systems as a result of an external constraint, which is that of the environment. So this is not something that we were given to have to kind of develop an idea about previously. If there was some idea, it tended to always be the various kinds of fantasies about endless sources of energy, utopian ideas about this moment when we reach some kind of energy source that we'd have indefinitely. Still exists, of course, today in various kinds of ideas, models of fusion or fission energy. But there's this sort of this sensibility that we've created a certain kind of society. We've done it globally. We've done it in a way that our identities, our sensibilities, our feelings, our desires are mapped into it in a very strong and powerful way. We've done it so that it's global. And now we have to think about what it means on the other side of this system. I don't want to kind of take up all of the time, but I will say this. Yeah, even a company like Shell, its future energy systems unit, that occasionally tries to come up with a way to kind of think about what energy will look like, energy systems, global energy systems will look like down the road. They have suggested that the maximum amount that we could have per person per year would be something like 100 gigajoules of energy. Because there'd be such a large population of people. And they're imagining that 100 gigajoules would be mixed forms of energy. So probably still would have some fossil fuels, but lots of other, a bigger portion of renewables. So that would be 1/3 of what an average American uses today. And it would be less than an average person in China uses today. And they're imagining 100 gigajoules would allow for a decent quality, enough energy input for a decent quality of life. They don't describe what that might be. This still demands a certain kind of refiguring of our desires, and it has to be something more than just a sense that we cut down, we do less, because that's not a mode that we work well in. And that just won't work. So one is this kind of mapping, and it is something that there have been moments all throughout history when people are alert to this. But I think the current moment is something different and something we have to attend to collectively. The other thing I will say again is that another takeaway for me is that I do think that it is quite difficult to represent this and the degree to which energy shapes us into a certain kind of, for lack of a better word, society. And infects every part of us, inhabits every part of us. It's difficult to represent it, I will say again, in literature, especially in 20th century literature, especially post-1945 when it has the greatest degree. It seems to be difficult to represent it because it's not there. It doesn't represent it. There are representations of oil. Usually oil just stands in for being really rich. So like in like the TV series Dallas, which many of us might know here, all that oil does is make them wealthy, and it allows JR to wear a cowboy hat or something. It doesn't really have this kind of discussion about like, well, how does that make us the kind of creatures we are, so that we might do something about it. It's interesting, the example of Moby Dick. I think Moby Dick does do this really, really intriguingly well. And it does it in form, and it does it in terms of all of the kinds of things, because it's kind of actually dealing with that earlier transition from one energy source to another, because there's already that hint of the oil era on the horizon. But I don't think that I think Ghosn says this for different reasons, but I'm not sure we have the same kind of representational resource in literature for this moment. There are lots of ones. I say it in an extreme way to suggest that we kind of have to look for it. There are things in science fiction, although science fiction too attends less to energy than one might imagine. I think art is perhaps one of the places. I mean, I have spent a lot of time with artists, perhaps because I see it there most powerfully in terms of the way that you're describing it, Carolyn, where there's that pushing towards the edges of what the degree to which it inhabits us, as opposed to just like showing a picture of an oil barrel.
Yeah, so I think the key question is whether what will change us resides in the realm of representation. I mean, I'm not sure that artistic intelligence is best served by, the Mizrach image. It's an incredible image. It's a horrifying image. Hasn't seemed to change us. You know what I'm saying? So I think in my thinking, I'm trying to think of what art is on the edge of changing us from Homo sapiens sapiens to maybe Homo extensa or Homo symbiotica, or that's to me the challenge of this work.
That's something we can come back to think of, if any, the agency of literary and artistic work in that radical reimagining of a next energy transition, which would require kind of a genealogy of our past engagement with energy systems, with the oil novel, some of which has resided a lot in post-colonial literature, as you pointed to. But I think what I'd like to do is maybe open the floor for a series of questions from the audience, and maybe in kind of to respect the schedule that we're operating on, take a few questions at a time, and then allow each of our panelists to respond to these. So I'll probably take 3 or 4 questions if we have from the audience, and then hear back from our panelists. Yeah.
Hi. So the contemporary philosopher Eugene Thacker begins his book with the words, "We are doomed," or in certain translations, "We are screwed." And I wonder if this idea of doing something about the future is itself not founded on a certain kind of optimism with energy itself that comes to us from the dawn of the 20th century, or maybe slightly before. In other words, what Thacker calls cosmic pessimism, is that a resource that we might deploy today to think about a time where it's already too late?
I have certainly lived most of my life not seeing energy. And it's now that the transition is happening that I'm beginning to pay attention to a lot of stuff. Like, it's very obvious now that the US tax code has tremendous subsidies. I didn't know that. I've lived most of my life without knowing this kind of stuff, right? So it's becoming clearly more visible. But generally speaking, I think something like IoT and supply chain is making a lot of stuff visible again that has been invisible to us. I mean, this is generally speaking the case, and that could also be the case for oil, right? I mean, you could imagine something like buying gas at the pump, or maybe maybe the sockets in the wall, and there would be signs, of electricity kills, and if you see what I mean, what is the countering the alienation that we have from the generation of the energy.
Yeah, so maybe we can start there. And so on the modalities of narrating a future, from techno-utopianism to kind of more cosmic pessimism and everywhere in between, is there a more kind of productive, if I may use the term, or more optimal genre of engaging the future? And then I guess the question on legibility and making visible and the possible advantages or limits that we have in kind of that moment of realization of the presence of energy. So maybe, Rose, we can start with...
Yeah, they're very different. I would just say the question I think we're all facing is whether we have to let go of a vision of history as progress, and whether that is necessary or viable at this point. You use the word pessimism. I think of it more as resignation or just limits to, and that means then what do you care about? I do think that's the big question that is out there, and I'm not presenting an answer, but I'm just saying I think you're asking perhaps one of the most fundamental question about this historical moment.
Yeah, and I think to try and bridge both questions, I'm not ready to give up on culture. I mean, I do think that literature and art have very powerful ways of mobilizing us, not through explicit politics always, but through mobilizing a broader aesthetic. So I've started thinking about all of the campaigns for small changes that relied on aesthetic judgments. For example, the two Boston ladies who decided that it was disgusting to wear birds on your head, right? They worked with the Audubon Society, it was like 1890 or something, and from 300,000 birds that were being slaughtered for the New York hat trade, that essentially went to zero. Well, maybe not zero. I think you can still buy turkey feathers and things, but that was an aesthetic judgment. Turning us against tobacco was in some sense an aesthetic of just both empathizing with bartenders and, kind of understanding health to be secondhand smoke. In other words, it was a combination of kind of enlarging empathy beyond individual choice and legal apparatuses, but it was also a kind of an aesthetic that revulsion was somehow produced around that. Corsets, whale bones and corsets, right? This was an aesthetic recoiling from something that had been highly fashionable and darling and beautiful to being disgusting. And why would you ever do that? So I'm optimistic in that sense that we can operate culturally to enlarge the envelope, as it were, of our connections and make some sort of change in that way. So, there are lots of studies about this. My own mother was like a chain smoker at one point. She said, every time I see one of those ads, it makes me so anxious, I just want to light up, right? So, having something by the plug that says, energy kills or something, and people are just like, fuck that, I want to live my life. But there are other ways of persuading and aggregating and, so it'll just be interesting to see whether we can pull it off, and if we don't, we'll be extinct, It's like a very, the pessimism is justified, if we can't pull it off. Most species apparently live for about 3 million years. That's about what we've managed so far, so, maybe our time is up. But it is a challenge that, we have achieved tremendous cultural evolution, so it's a challenge that we can now own, as Imre suggested, right? We can have an intentional transition if we're able to work a little more like ants and a little less like, predators.
So I'll speak about legibility first too. I think that these issues are becoming more legible in lots of different registers. For a number of weeks and even today, it is front page news. Pipelines are front page news. I never would have expected that. They're front page news in Canada for not just because they cross a border, and not just because a president gets involved, but because they also come into contact with First Nations territories, which have newfound powers. And so there's kind of interesting mixes of political legibility, environmental legibility, future anxieties, political transitions that are all kind of coming together. So I think that it is in cultural realm that there's more attention and feeling for the ways in which one might have to make it legible. And I liked your examples a lot, Caroline, because it may be that legibility isn't about showing a bunch of refineries, or it isn't like the kind of thing that Edward Bertinsky did in his thing on oil. It might be more like doing this kind of work. And that comes to the really great question about drawing on Eugene Thacker's work. I guess I have two things to say to that. On one register, I really think that the kind of question you asked is the question we need to ask. So how do we disrupt the logic, the old logic that we build into the solution, even as we're, how do we disrupt the old logic we build into the solution, even as we're identifying that as the problem and we kind of continue it? This is a difficult thing to do. And it might be the right thing to ask ourselves over and over and over again. In the kind of perhaps we can do it in a dialectical fashion though, as opposed to just kind of giving up. Second thing to do, however, is I can't get away from the fact that what that would not permit are questions about energy justice. So I would like there still to be a question about energy justice, and the kind of the sense that we're doomed doesn't allow that discussion to happen. So the energy justice question is, in very, very simple ways, are why do I, as a Canadian, get to use 75 times more energy per day with all of the capacities and possibilities that it allows me than somebody does in Haiti? What could possibly permit that? If we have, again, a repeat of the Rawlsian original position and add energy to it, nobody in the Rawlsian original position would not make sure that they got to use equal amounts of energy. I mean, once you kind of add it to older kind of conversations, it kind of nudges a material element into questions that we have about politics, ethics, and so on that I'm kind of not ready to give up in a I guess, a less like ontological, metaphysical realm of that, like that you're posing with Thatcher, although that's very much the kind of direction that I would say that I am conscious of as the way that you would have to interrupt this older desire. So not to say too much, but where this kind of doesn't work out is the following. Like I'll often say, when you change habit, you change how people inhabit a space. My mother, who's a immigrant from Hungary, doesn't know how to use a blue bin. She doesn't. I mean, you can say to her, put this piece of paper in the blue bin, and she'll say, oh, yes, of course. My son doesn't know how not to use it. So that's an interesting transition of habit. Now, that doesn't answer your question in the sense that, well, he uses it a lot, is the problem, because he feels like it's solved. So there can be more and more paper. And that kind of logic of the more isn't interrupted in the way that we'd want through that kind of reframing of habit. So my question would be, can we have a reframing of habit that would keep that sensation that I have of injustice that has happened around energy while doing the kind of work to nudge aside the eschatology that you were pointing to?
Can I throw something else in there? So legibility, there are people who think about this desperately every single day for the COP17 and the next generations of these frameworks. And the one that I heard recently is about planetary frameworks. And so they're the economists are literally trying to make legible the capacity of the Earth system to allow waste in some sense, and to absorb waste. And none of this has been reflected in previous economic models, right? So the planetary framework, which apparently is a phrase that our current EPA doesn't allow you to put in your grant application, but it's a specific approach to making visible, to making legible the too much question. Anyway, so I just recommend to people that they follow these constant efforts to find better ways. They used to have a Venn diagram of people and resources and money, and it became a Mickey Mouse with money, this like giant swollen face, and then people, and nothing was intersecting. So the planetary boundaries framework is a way to image planetary systems that don't allow you to disaggregate them from the ultimate boundary of the planet itself. So it's just an interesting address to this legibility question.
Rose, any kind of...
No, just I know what you're talking
Yeah.
about, and I think it's spectacular as a way of visualizing and therefore thinking.
And making legible the capacity of the planet itself to absorb our uses.
Okay, so what we'll do is, in the interest of time, is that we can continue the conversation over the reception outside, and we'll get to continue it for much longer. But I'd like to thank Imre for both sharing the wealth of his work on this subject and giving us the best of all excuses to come together here
Move this around.
at MIT and think of, how
Mumford is in there.
we have kind of an obligation to think of a genealogy of practices, literary and otherwise, on the question of energy and the environment, to think of the legibility and the imperative of our present condition, and inevitably ask the question of the future that accompanies both, of what forms of energy transitions to whom, and how can broadly aesthetic practices and literary practices contribute to such reimagining. So thank you very much for your time, and hope to continue this conversation.